Colleagues, thank you very much for accepting this invitation, and thank you, Dr. Tolosa, for coming to our university to talk to us. I'd like to start thanking you all for accepting our invitation to this talk about interculturality and language education for our School of Language Sciences and the Master's Program on Interlinguistic and Intercultural Studies and the EILA Research Group, Grupo de Investigación en Lingüística Aplicada. It's an honor to have Dr. Constanza Tolosa as a visitor in our academic unit. Dr. Tolosa is a senior lecturer in languages education in the School of Curriculum and Pedagogy at the Faculty of Education and Social Work at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She is an experienced language teacher and language teacher educator. She teaches in different programs ranging from pre-service language teacher education to postgraduate courses on contemporary pedagogies. She led a cohort-based doctorate in education in learning in the digital age from 2019 to 2021. Her areas of expertise include languages education, language teacher education, intercultural language education, e-learning, and teachers' beliefs and practices. Today, Dr. Tolosa will share the findings of a research project that investigated how teachers working in 4 primary intermediate schools in New Zealand supported young beginner language learners to develop their intercultural capability through learning a second language. These findings are compiled in the book, Journeys Towards Intercultural Capability in Language Classrooms, Voices from Students, Teachers, and Researchers, which serves as the title of our presentation today. Welcome, Dr. Tolosa. Thank you for sharing your work with us, and the floor is yours.
Gracias. Muchas gracias. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for those of you coming and those of you who are far away or farther than this room. I hope it's okay with you if I switch from English to Spanish. The presentation will be in English, but I feel a bit awkward being Colombian and speaking in English in Colombia. Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias a las personas que tan generosamente han hecho posible esta visita. Ante todo a mis estudiantes doctorales, doctores María y Orlando, y a la amable invitación de parte de la Escuela de Ciencias del Lenguaje. Carlos, muchas gracias. Aldemar, un gusto vernos. Norbella, muchas gracias. Y a todos los asistentes. Y pues comprimir un libro completo en 45 minutos, pues es un reto que no había hecho antes y espero no pasarme del tiempo primero, estar muy consciente del tiempo que pasa. Y segundo, lo que hice en la presentación, que creo que la pueden circular si la necesitan después, es realmente escoger algunos puntos que me parece relevante e interesante compartir con ustedes. El libro se hizo después de 2 años de la investigación y en el libro lo que quisimos captar, como su nombre lo indica, fueron como el trayecto, la trayectoria de lo que sucedió. Y tal vez lo más interesante para nosotros era no solamente oír a los estudiantes y a los profesores, sino reflexionar nosotros como investigadores y educadores de profesores sobre la experiencia. Entonces, para aquellos de ustedes que son investigadores en este momento, que están haciendo maestría o que piensan hacer investigación, ese capítulo me parece bastante relevante. Y aquellos de ustedes que están en pregrado y están en otros momentos y de pronto no han leído tanto la literatura sobre interculturalidad, los capítulos sobre el desarrollo de la interculturalidad en los estudiantes y en los profesores puede ser interesante. Entonces, rápidamente contextualizo. Ahora no le gustó algo. Perdón. Creo que es más fácil que yo haga aquí. So the study was a 2-year research project that was funded by the Ministry of Education in New Zealand, and investigated 5 teachers. Eventually, one of them dropped the second year, so that's why we talk about 4. In the intermediate school sector, so students who are aged 11 and 12 years old. And we wanted to see how these teachers could support their learners to develop intercultural competence as part of learning an additional language. And one of the earlier distinctions and caveats that I will mention is that we switch between intercultural competency and intercultural capability. And I'll explain that in a second. But I am very mindful that the 2 terms are not equivalent. And that's something that for those of you who are starting to look into this is something to think about. The words competence and the word capability mean different things. But for the purposes of how we develop the project, you will see that I switch from one and the other. And what we did in terms of how we work with the teachers is that we developed what is called inquiries. So overall, we did a collaborative action research project because we wanted to honor the knowledge, the experience, and the expertise of the teachers themselves. Very often as researchers, we go and have extractive methods of researching a site. And in this case, we wanted to work with them, not extract from them. And that was quite important for us. The context, as it was clear in the introduction, is that I work in New Zealand, which probably many of you know where it's located. I don't have the map of the world, but it's way down. Sorry. ¿Allá arriba? No. I can continue talking while they organize the technology so that we don't waste time. So in New Zealand, education is universally available, and most of it is public, state-led, with very, very small private sector. And it's compulsory for children between 5 and 17 years of age. We worked in classrooms where they were in years 7 and 8, age approximately 11 and 12 years old. The other thing to mention about the New Zealand context that is probably different to how it is. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, let me just find my way here. Apologies for those who were just seeing the presentation. So I'll pick up from here. Is that in New Zealand, there is a national curriculum, but it's a national curriculum that can be enacted by schools autonomously. So each school can decide how they develop the same curriculum that is national. And you will see why that is important for those of us in the world of languages. The curriculum, which was published, the current curriculum was published in 2007, and it emphasizes preparation of learners with a range of transferable skills. So it was at the moment, and those of you young enough will probably not know this difference, but curriculum historically moved from being very focused on content to being focused on competencies and skills. And that's what this curriculum, that was the switch in this curriculum. And one of those competencies that the curriculum names as a capability, and that's where the whole conceptual mess starts, is that there is attention given to the importance of developing students' intercultural capability. The idea in 2007 was to honor the indigenous population that is very strong in New Zealand that are called the Maori. Those of you who like rugby and have watched New Zealand rugby will have probably seen the haka, which is a special kind of salutation from the Maori. And at that moment in 2007, intercultural capability had to do with that, with honoring the indigenous population of the country. However, interestingly, at the same time, and for the first time in the history of education of New Zealand, there was a curriculum area called learning languages that allowed space for different languages to be taught in schools. They used to be taught in secondary schools, especially in very traditional secondary schools that followed the British system, because New Zealand is still a Commonwealth country from being colonized by Britain. And some of those grammar schools used to teach especially French. That used to be a language that was highly sought. However, the problem was that although there was an introduction and an expectation for languages to be offered, they are not compulsory. So students do not need a requirement, as you do here in Colombia, to have a certain level of English before, for example, moving into university and eventually doing other things. So that is a limitation that New Zealand has in terms of how we teach languages there, that it is not obligatory for students to take it or for schools to teach it. They have to offer some sort of languages, but not as a requirement as they do here, for example. Or to be fair, in most of the world, New Zealand is a very odd exception. Now, just very briefly to contextualize, the expectation that at 2007 was set was that we were moving away from conceiving learning languages as only a linguistic dimension to include a communicative dimension, and in particular, to develop intercultural communicative competence, okay? So we sort of unpack that term. We were looking at language, and language when it is communicated, and with the acknowledgement that every time we're communicating with anyone, we are doing that interculturally, okay? So that's what the curriculum did, and I do most of the teacher education program in my university, and that's what that diagram that you have on the left is, where we say we have communication as the core strand, and then we have language knowledge and culture knowledge, which is a little bit problematic because we call it cultural knowledge, as if it was something that is easily transferable. And we all know that culture is not that easily transferable. In fact, it is not transferable. It is something to reflect, to share, and to live with the others, not necessarily a content that is easily movable from one to the other. So that's some of the sort of reflections that we bring to the teachers all the time. And finally, what we wanted to look at here in this diagram is that if you're a teacher in primary school, where you're not a specialist teacher of languages, you typically are a very qualified elementary teacher. But in order to teach languages, you also need to be proficient in some language that you're going to be teaching for obvious reasons, or at least somehow proficient. And you need to have some sort of knowledge, at least, or understanding of education or pedagogy for teaching languages, the knowledge of the curriculum. And then we're adding all that dimension on the right-hand side, which is the construct of intercultural communicative competence, which is very complex, and methodological skills to teach that. So if you're only an elementary trained teacher, on the green outside, you have all those layers to develop to be able to be competently teaching what the curriculum expects from you, which is a huge ask for a teacher in primary who's very busy, as all teachers are, and who are typically teaching 7 different areas of the curriculum, right? Because the primary teacher teaches science, mathematics, I don't know, music, arts, whatever, right? And in top of that, languages. So for us, it was very interesting to go to the schools and see how the teachers were dealing with this complexity. We were not making any assumptions when we arrived there to see what they were doing. We were just interested in learning from their own experience. So I'll very, very briefly touch on some of the literature that we drew on. And one of the literature that I'm not going to include, and I know there are people in this room that are way more experts on that than myself, is that instead of looking initially with the teachers at intercultural capability or intercultural competence, which is a very complex concept, we looked at them in terms of a intercultural communicative competence. But what we did is in our initial literature review, we saw this mismatch between how theoretically interculturality has advanced in the world and how little we knew about how it was enacted in real classrooms, right? So there's people who work up there in very abstract terms with very different definitions of interculturality coming from anthropology, sociology, critical theory, different areas. But the fact of the matter is, we wanted to know how all of that theory arrived down here to the ground, to the teachers who are, after all, the ones who are responsible of dealing with that in their classrooms, right? So it's very easy for us researchers to sit on our comfortable chairs and talk about interculturality. A very different reality is go to a classroom with 35 students who I need to be teaching with an intercultural focus. So that's what we wanted to do. So all of this literature that you see here is sort of the one that started to draw our attention because we saw that it was very difficult to realize in practice what everyone was trying to see. And that not only contextual factors, but also cognitive and affective factors of each individual were playing a role in how intercultural language education was going to be sort of put in motion. And finally, we also wanted, as I said at the beginning, to honor what the teachers knew and their expertise. So we wanted to look at it methodologically. And here, those of you who have research methods experience know that we could have gone to investigate this in different ways. We chose to look at it from a way in which we wanted the teachers themselves to lead the way in the way their inquiries, what we call here investigación acción, how they were going to be looking at their own realities, their own classrooms, their own students. So this area of teaching reflections and helping them sort of start reflecting as to what it is for me to teach the culture or cultures of the places where this language is spoken, but also what makes sense for my students. Now, one of the sort of weaknesses of doing that is that as researchers, you lose a lot of control. And we typically don't like to lose control, right? Both teachers and researchers, we typically don't like to lose control. But we were trying to build trust with these 5 teachers in such a way that they felt that they could at some point say, look, this doesn't work for me. Very nice, all of this that you're telling me, but it doesn't work for me. So we were trying to avoid that. And from the beginning, set it up in such a way that they were encouraged to build their own inquiries into their own context. In New Zealand, by the way, as a parenthesis, there is an expectation that all teachers develop an inquiry, at least an inquiry sort of stance in how they approach their work. They're always wondering, why is this working today? Why is this not working today? So there's sort of a mentality that you need to be constantly asking of yourself, how am I working? And sort of stepping to a side and seeing how the students are actually perceiving what I'm doing. So I'm not going to go into more depth in terms of theory, and there's lots of theory about that. And in the book, we spend 2 chapters in looking at the literature that has to do with this. So I'm not going to bore you with all of those details, especially on a Friday afternoon. That would be quite cruel. But I want to move on a little bit to talk more about the study itself, because at least for those in the master's program, it might be interesting for you to see how this actually developed. So as I said before, we develop what we call collaborative action research between 5 researchers, and all of us were not only researchers, but we are also teacher educators. And for me, that distinction is quite crucial, because when you are responsible for teaching the future generations of teachers, there's an added layer of complexity there in my work. As a researcher, it's easy to go to a site, collect data, and then publish it. But if that data is going for those who are going to become teachers, I personally feel an added layer of responsibility, because if anything, I want them to probably not use myself as a model, but to develop their own stances as to how that's going to happen in their own classrooms. So that's the model that we chose. And it's a model that is time consuming, it's quite expensive, and it allowed a lot of possibilities with the individual teachers, but 5 is quite a limited number, right? But that's how we decided. So each teacher worked with 1 researcher, and we sort of worked independently. In each school was treated as a case study, because we also wanted to be consistent with the fact that the development of interculturality is very contextual. It's very different, my classroom to Maria's classroom to Norbella's classroom, because we all are, even if we're in the same site, we are teaching differently, right? However, we met 4 times over the 2 years, and we had long 2 days, usually, typically, and we will have a residential meeting. We had 5 participants. As I said, the last teacher here, Tamara, can I move this here? Let's see if I can move this here. Thank you. These were the 5 teachers we worked with. I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but we had 2 teachers who taught Mandarin Chinese as second language, 1 who taught Japanese, 1 who taught French, and 1 who was teaching Te Reo Maori, which, as I said, is the indigenous language in New Zealand. And the schools were in different parts of the country. Some were in the North Island of New Zealand and some within the South Island. And if you look very quickly at the bottom row, you will see what we call the delivery pattern. Each school teaches languages very, very differently. And if you look only at the time that is allocated to languages, for example, for Mike in row 4, he only saw his students for French in 2 30-minute sessions per week, which is nothing. Anyone who has learned a language knows that that is nothing. But you can see that, and the difference is important for us, because as I mentioned before, in New Zealand, each school is autonomous in how they sort of enact the curriculum and how they interpret the curriculum and how much time they allocate to the curriculum. So if you compare that person to those who could see them more times, like Lillian on the first column there, she saw them 3 times 20 minutes, and then a modern language assistant, Mandarin language assistant saw them other 2 times, etc. They had much more. And Tamara here on the right-hand side was completely different, because Maori language was integrated to everything she taught. She was like the typical primary teacher who would teach all subjects, but she would throw a lot of Maori during the day. So it was, in that sense, we knew that we had to go for a case study approach, because it was impossible for us to draw any comparison that might have been valid across the teachers. The teachers themselves were very different. We had 1 person who was a native speaker of the language, who was Lillian, whereas all the others, as you can see, they were not even advanced in their proficiency. They were intermediate French, intermediate Japanese, intermediate Mandarin, okay? And that's, again, very typical of how languages are taught in New Zealand at that level. In secondary school, it's a little bit different. There's more proficiency expected from the teachers, etc. But in intermediate schools, this is very typical of how you can see in New Zealand how languages are taught. Right. This is a very busy slide, I apologize, but just wanted to show you that we worked for 2 years with them in 4 different phases. In phase 1, that was 4 months. It was 4 months where we collected baseline data, and we wanted to know the teachers. We wanted to know the schools. We wanted to meet the principal. I was lucky enough, I worked with the teacher of Japanese, Catherine, and it happened that the one day that I was there, they had Asian Language Day. So there was a lot of activities of students doing different things for Chinese and Japanese and Korean and other languages. And there were parents and so I was very, very immersed in a very special day that day. But basically we wanted to know where we were going to start with those teachers. And we interviewed them to sort of know what they thought of language teaching. And from that point on, we knew we were dealing definitely with 5 different cases, with 5 very different teachers who approach languages very differently, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, we knew that we were not going to be able to do something that was collectively more than case studies. Then you can see phases 2 and 3 are basically 2 iterations of the same sort of what we call an inquiry. Both times it started with a residential meeting and they developed their inquiry cycles. We observed their lessons at least 3 times. Some of us went more. Then we interview them. We interview the students. We spent quite a bit of time with them. And purposefully, we did that in 2 iterations because we wanted to see the end of a school year in phase 2. And then we wanted them to have like holiday break and then the start of a new school year. Okay, so phase 3, basically the teachers repeated the inquiry, but most of them changed the focus because they already felt that they knew a little bit more about what was being said and they were able to do it. And phase 4 is probably the one that we have spoken the least in all our presentations about the project, but it was a very unique phase in any research project that I'm aware of. And it was a moment where we sat with the teachers to look at all the reflective data that they had done over the 2 years. And they wrote with us, we helped them a little bit. So we call it co-writing, what we call engaging examples of practice, where they told their story, how they lived it, not how we saw it, but how they saw it. And we eventually, and I'll show you at the end, because we eventually published that, we were able to publish that, and it's a resource that is used in all schools now in New Zealand, because these are the true stories of the teachers talking about how they deal with that. So that's, yeah, I realized putting together this presentation for today that that's a phase that we could probably do more with. Right, so what did we find? We found a lot, and I had to be very selective for today. Again, I'm very mindful, and thank you again for being here on a Friday afternoon, that you probably don't have a lot of intention of staying here forever to listen to everything. So I selected, I think, 3 benefits and 2 challenges from the teachers. Of course, we have much more data from the teachers because the focus of the project was the teachers. Less data from the students, and then I'll tell you what we did with the other data about the researchers. So from the teachers, there's nothing, and I know some of the members of staff here have looked at interculturality, nothing earth-shattering, nothing that would change the way people talk about interculturality. Many studies in different parts of the world have found very similar things to what we found. The first benefit is that they actually developed an intercultural focus, because when we started, they didn't even know the term. They had never heard of it. They didn't know anything. They all say, oh, yeah, I teach culture in my class. Yeah. And then when we looked at how they taught it, it was a complete separation between how they would teach the language, and they will wait for culture to be taught on a Friday afternoon when the students were a bit tired, or, at the end of the school year when, students were in exams. So culture was seen as something peripheral, external, and something that could be moved anywhere. But through the 2 years, they actually were quite surprised to see, wow, I had never thought of that. I had never thought that whenever I'm showing them something, an image or a video clip or anything from the target language, I'm actually showing them something that has to do with culture. And every time we approach, for example, the teacher of French, he was incredibly honest and he would say, I never thought of food in those terms, for example. And French food it's almost a cliche, right? That everyone talks about French food as being, something very elegant, et cetera, et cetera. And he sort of unpacked that with his students and was very honest with them, saying like, ooh, escargot, right? We don't like that sort of thing. So it was very interesting to see how the teachers themselves were sort of making their own realizations on their own word. There was nothing that we were pushing them or telling them anything. We were just letting them see how this went. Their language teaching practices definitely changed, and I'll talk about how they change in a moment because it was an unexpected change. And they view the place of culture in language teaching very differently. So that was very refreshing for us, but it was sort of expected. That was the least that we were expecting, right? That they would be confronted with a new term. Therefore, they were learning about that term, and they were trying to see how that term will play into their classrooms. The second part was all the reflective part about the teachers as an area of personal interest for me, is that through these 2 cycles of inquiries, they learn to look at their own work very critically and very different and most of them were quite experienced. At least out of the 5, 3 of them were had more than 8 years of experience. They were quite experienced. And they had never thought of this sort of way of learning about their students or learning about their teaching. So we taught them a little bit about how to analyze data, for example, and how they could see and collect things from their students, including the interviews that we conducted, and look at how their students were reflecting on their teaching. That was quite interesting. But also they thought that it was very, very important when you embarked in any of these inquiries to be willing to change their practices, because that is something that historically all of us who have worked with teachers is one of the most difficult things, because there is this resistance. If this works for me, why are you coming here to tell me doing something different, right? And finally, some of them felt liberated from a narrow view of language teaching as something that was focused only on linguistics. Unfortunately, that's not what we wanted. Because they thought, oh, now I can do only culture and I can forget about the grammar. And we say, no, that's not what we meant. We almost had to intervene and say, no, that's not what we meant. We wanted to add a layer of complexity to the typical language teaching that we've all been sort of used to. But that's what happens when you are actually letting them lead the thing. And the third benefit was to see how the teachers enjoy seeing the outcomes in their students and how surprised they were that the students actually with very, I'm not talking about hours and hours and hours exploring interculturality. These were very, as you can see, 2 sessions, 30 minutes per week, very small time, but with a different focus. And the different focus made a difference to the students. So again, Mike, the teacher of French, who was the most experienced of the 5 teachers, he said, I had never had a group of students, and he had been teaching for quite a while by that time, who had actually had that openness to all of a sudden think about others from other cultures in a different way. That was quite significant for him. The others, as soon as Mike sort of shared that with us in one of the collective meetings, the others said, oh, that's right. In our school also this happened and this happened and that happened. So that sort of thing is quite important for them to see their students having a different type of outcome, more than the vocabulary quiz or the grammar worksheet or whatever it is that they used to do before. They thought the students had an increase in motivation toward language learning. Typically, those were lessons that were very active. Students were doing a lot of things. In the case of the teacher who worked with me in Japanese, she wanted the students to look at Japanese food in a different way that was not stereotypical, right? Only sushi. Everyone thinks about Japanese food as only sushi. And she wanted them to see sort of the aesthetics of food. She wanted them to explore. And these were 11-year-olds. I'm not talking about adults. I'm talking about students who are 11 years old. They were looking at the food that was given in the schools, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So she actually said, I can see that they're motivated beyond just, learning about this or learning about that. And they also felt an increasing connection to the outside world. And this is something that is very New Zealand. New Zealand is very isolated from the world, physically, geographically, right? We're far, 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 far away. You know, you go to the South Pole and then return a little bit and then you're in New Zealand, right? So it's very, very isolated. There's a sense as a country of isolation. So feeling that connection was quite important and significant both for both the teachers and the students. They say, oh, we now understand that, you know, when so-and-so says this, I can do that. So that's quite interesting. But of course, not everything was nice. Not everything was pretty. And there were lots of challenges. Some of them were personal and we call the others sort of systemic. Because the teachers were very insecure. Teachers typically feel okay teaching language, even if they are not very good at the language, but it's very easy to go to a grammar book or to, to Google and look at vocabulary lists and all of that. It's very easy. Even pronunciation nowadays, you just click and someone says it for you, right? But talking about culture requires from the teacher a lot of study, a lot of preparation, especially if you don't want to just touch surface levels, right? If you want to go deep into what food means for Japanese, you're not just looking at how pretty it looks. You have to understand why they are insistent in food being, pleasant to the eye, etc. So that was quite sort of the through the 2 years that was constant. That they were very insecure. They didn't want to perpetuate stereotypes. They didn't want to arrive to the classroom without feeling very secure of what they were doing. One of the teachers of Chinese, the one who's not a native speaker, she chose a unit on family. And you're probably aware that in China for many, many years, families were only allowed to have one child, what is called the one-child policy, which is very controversial for the Chinese. I mean, for the rest of us, it sounds weird and it sounds controlling and it sounds whoa, but for them, it is a big deal. And it's a huge taboo for them to talk about that. So when she opened talking about that, she was very, very afraid of parents probably calling her and saying, why are you talking about this? Which is very politically, very, very controversial. Again, with students who are 11. If I'm talking to you as adults, I wouldn't mind a debate, but with 11-year-olds, you need to be very, very careful. So they were very worried about that. Now, the next two was the obvious one for all teachers, lack of time. Teachers never have time for anything. And we were lucky, and that's why I say that it was a very expensive project because we paid for what is called release of their time. So every time we would go to the school, they would have like the day off. Someone was teaching their normal lessons and they were working with us on the side. But that's not the reality of any school or of any project. And that was their last concern, that it was not practical to sustain that level of inquiry every time they were teaching, which is true. Being reflective, a reflective teacher is very consuming. It's consuming of energy, of time, of even of your personality. Having to sort of question what you do every day, every time you're teaching is quite time consuming. So they say it's probably not sustainable. So we had to deal with that. And the other challenges had to do with the curriculum, which is, as I said before, that they were feeling that having such a strong focus on interculturality was detracting from learning the language. That the time that was being used in these inquiries, because these students were beginners, the inquiries with the students, the reflections were done in English. So they were losing time from learning Japanese to discuss the food in Japan in English, you see? So although we're all for bilinguality and translanguaging, the fact that the teacher had to switch from teaching the target language to English in order for the students to be able to actually talk about it, because they didn't have enough language to talk about it, then it meant that they were losing time. They thought that there was an incompatibility between language learning and intercultural reflection, in the sense that the levels of language were very, very big. And finally, and this is what for us as researchers, we were quite freaked out when this happened, is that they were very happy separating language and culture even more. So that was absolutely the opposite of what we wanted. And when we realized, we felt absolutely miserable. But that is the reality of research. Sometimes you have research outcomes that are not the ones that you had planned, or the ones that you expected, or the ones that you wanted. But that's the reality. So we had to live with it. And I'll tell you in a second how we dealt with it. So let me move very quickly to students, because I see time ticking. I'm sorry. One of it is that they were developing this interculturality idea about interculturality, and we sort of saw it as in a continuum. Some of them were still at a level of facts. They love facts. I don't know, haven't taught in Colombia for 20 years, but in New Zealand, students are fascinated with facts. They are very good at memorizing things, and they love knowing where things are, et cetera, et cetera. So some students stayed at that level. Others were looking at noticing differences. Others were developing openness to difference, and all others were, very comfortable with talking about difference, until a couple of them in each of the classrooms were arriving at what we call the third place, right? On actually being able to understand the others as much as they can understand themselves. And they had an increase in motivation, just very anecdotally, because they said, oh, I want to continue learning Japanese in high school. Oh, I want to do that. And the teachers reported we had never heard that before. So they actually felt, wow, this is the first time we did something different, and the students actually want to continue with the language. And some of the unexpected outcomes is that they were very, very engaged, and the teachers were very surprised. They say, oh, they love the cultural. They can spend hours and hours and hours on that. They were using the language much more than before. So it was a lot of a paradox with an incompatibility with the previous finding. And they wanted to continue with the language. Right. So most of these findings are not new in research, honestly. We didn't do anything that was completely different. What we did for the book is that I personally insisted that I wanted us, the researchers, reflect on what we learned and how our journey was. And that's where the name of the book actually came about, because we talked about the journeys. And one of them, and I'm not going to read all of that, don't worry, is that working with teachers, although we were very experienced as teacher educators, this type of work with teachers was quite difficult for us and challenging. Again, because we want to have control, and giving them the control of things was quite scary. And there was a lot of money involved because we had funding from the government. So it was not like we could just spend hours and hours letting them reflect and not do anything with it. So there were some tensions. One of the tensions is we had our own agenda. We definitely wanted to go somewhere with this project, and each teacher had their own agenda. So we had to negotiate those a lot. The teachers were very different, which is we all know, we're all very different, but they were very, very, very different. Even the two teachers of Chinese were like opposites, complete opposites. So we had to navigate a lot of those things. And the fact that we came to them and they did volunteer, but they sort of were committed to our project, not their project so much. So that was not very good. And finally, the reality that they don't have a lot of time was quite, we thought being very generous and giving them that release time will allow them time for more reflection, but it didn't. And what we did was try to develop this relationship that is called a critical friend relationship, where, again, we were trying to be very horizontal. We didn't want them to feel that but it did happen. I would come to the school where I was visiting, and Catherine said, oh, I planned all these things for you. And I said, that's not what I wanted. I didn't want you to plan anything particular for me. I wanted you to teach normally. But they felt that they always wanted to do that. So establishing rapport and all of that was quite difficult. We did have a lot of critical friend conversations, but some of them were quite difficult. There were two of the pairs that didn't work as well. And then we tried different strategies for reflection for them, because reflecting, I don't know about you guys, if you're being asked to reflect a lot in your courses, probably, but it's quite boring after a while, think about this, write about this. And so we tried to come up with different ways of reflecting, visuals and, all sorts of things. I can talk about that more if anyone is interested. And we also wanted ownership of their journeys. Is that why we insisted in the last semester to actually having them co-writing and co-publishing? So the critical incidence, just to finish, is that when I sat down to look at all the documentation of 2 years, literally hundreds and hundreds of files of reflections, observations, interviews, all of the data that we have, all of the data from the students, we looked at 5, which is we document in one of the chapters of the book, 5 what we call critical incidents, moments where certain things that we had planned some way went the other way. And I had already mentioned some of that, right? And some of them, again, are not new. We know that conceptual understandings take time and they're not easy. You know, reflective practices are ideal, but they are time consuming and debilitating. I myself have a very hard time doing that. The separation of language and culture was a huge critical incident for us. And we ended up, you know, sort of confirming what others had said, is that collaborative action research is quite messy. I am a very organized person. Some of my students know that. And so anything that was not prescribed was quite difficult to deal with. So some of conclusions is, again, as I said before, there's probably nothing new, majorly new in what we did. However, we did uncover some new empirical evidence about the way the teachers were reflecting and how they develop interculturality from that. The inquiry process was very, very useful for us. The tensions between the goals of language teaching is something that is still unresolved, and we are hoping that this next year that there is a curricular reform that we can do something about it. And our proposal, which is the last bullet point there, is the reason why I'm here talking to my colleagues at this university, is because we have this idea that interculturality should not be seen only in languages. It's something that needs to be developed across everything that we do, because it's not a content, it's an attitude in life. It's how open, respectful, tolerant I am towards others of any kind, not only culturally or demographically or linguistically different, all types of difference. So that's sort of my next project, because I really want to look at this not only as how it is lived in the languages classroom, which is my expertise, but also in all teacher education. So that's sort of the end of the book, and I'm sorry because I had to squeeze a lot of that. So thank you so much. I just want to flag very quickly my last slide. The book on the left-hand side is the one that we co-wrote with the teachers. It's a very thin booklet, but it has the stories of the teachers. It's beautiful, and it is now in all the schools and available for all the teachers of languages in New Zealand. And the one on the right-hand side is the one that is what I tried to summarize today, which is sort of the academic book out of the project. So that's all from me. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tolosa, for such an interesting talk. So many challenges that you faced and you went through. Some similar to the ones that we face here also, working with schools. Yeah. So we'll talk about that later. Yeah. We will spend some time for questions here from the audience that is here in the auditorium, and we also have some questions in the chat. So I don't know if anyone has any comment or question. Could be in English or Spanish. You decide which language to use. So I guess we will move to the chat. Dr. Marina Guapacha, thank you so much for being instrumental to have this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tolosa, for this insightful talk. Yeah, we can think of similarities and differences between the two contexts, and I would like to highlight some of them later on. But first, yeah, we have a question. Like Cesar Tenorio, he's asking, well, in Colombia, there are no specialized ELT teachers in primary public schools. This affects the process in the long term. Those primary public school teachers who teach English do it probably from a grammatical approach. What could you suggest in that case?
Yeah, I would say it's very similar to New Zealand in that case, because there are no specialist teachers in primary. So they're usually teachers who, for different reasons, know the language or speak the language or are interested enough in the language to learn it while they are teachers. So that's a huge challenge. And I know I'm very aware how this happens in Colombia, and the level of proficiency of teachers is usually lower than what is necessary. What I would suggest is that, and that's why our conclusion is probably something that is going to go against our own learning area, which is that interculturality should be seen more holistically and sort of more transversal to what we do in all the curriculum. So it is not necessarily something that is only owned and understood by the teacher of languages. It could be done by teachers across curriculum levels. But ideally, we should be giving some tools to the teachers in primary and well, here we don't have intermediate school, but in primary, under secondary, to be able to teach the language. One of the things that worries me, has always worried me about the Colombian case, and we were talking about that earlier with the different sort of promotion of bilinguality that tends to be seen as only English, Spanish, is that there is this expectation that the teachers need to cover a lot. And so the students lose motivation because every time they have a new teacher, they sort of start from zero again. So if they do second grade with one person and then third grade with another one, they sort of start the same. And over time, they lose a lot of motivation, and that is counter to what we want to do. So you either do it really well from early on or don't do it at all and wait until the specialist in secondary can do it better. I prefer that. And I am horrified when I hear about bilingual preschool. Horrified. Because if anything, we need to be very strong in our first language before we switch to any other language, except for those who grow up bilingual. If you're lucky enough to grow up in a bilingual home, that's fine. But in a school, 30 minutes of singing English in what is it, kindy or whatever it's called here, that's nonsense. They don't learn anything in that way. But that's not the question, sorry. It's a different debate.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, there are some comments here by Professor Lidia Nastriciro. Bueno, dice mil gracias por su presentación, doctora Tolosa, y bueno, gracias a los organizadores de la conferencia. Y la profesora Fanny Hernández dice, I find it very relevant to emphasize that intercultural capability development should done in all areas, not only in language classes. Mm-hmm.
Completely agree.
Yeah. Well, well, you mentioned that inquiry, well, teachers in New Zealand have to do an inquiry. Is that compulsory? And if so, who reviews those inquiries?
Yeah, in order to, how is it called that?
Bueno, para nuestros estudiantes, inquiry es, bueno, action research o investigación en el aula que se hace aquí.
Sí, la investigación en el aula es una expectativa casi como de una actitud de parte de los docentes que todo el tiempo estén reflexionando sobre cómo está funcionando lo que yo enseño, que es lo que se supone que cada profesor debería hacer. Pero como cada año los profesores son evaluados, ¿cómo se llama eso aquí? Evaluación de los profesores, ¿cierto? Appraisal allá. Sí, como son evaluados en sus competencias como docentes, hacer esos ciclos de investigación-acción son evaluados en esas evaluaciones. Entonces ellos tienen que demostrar, en los últimos 2 años yo he recogido datos de mis estudiantes acerca de lo que sea el enfoque de su inquiry. Entonces es una expectativa y se les mira cada vez que son evaluados, y obviamente esa evaluación se tiene una relación como con si avanzan en su escalafón o si se les paga más, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces sí es bastante monitoreado, digámoslo así. No es muy estricto, digamos, no es que los van a echar si no hacen una este año, pero sí se espera que desarrollen como esa actitud a estar cuestionándose todo el tiempo y reflexionando todo el tiempo sobre el efecto que tiene lo que ellos hacen sobre sus estudiantes.
¿Quién evalúa esas?
Quien sea, no es algo muy formal, es una cosa muy interna a cada colegio, y en los colegios de primaria hay lo que se llama el deputy principal. En cada colegio hay como un vicerrector, digámoslo así. Esa persona normalmente está a cargo de eso, y en la secundaria son los jefes de área. Entonces, si yo soy profesora de física, mi jefe de área estaría mirando, yo estaría como compartiendo mi proyecto con esa persona. No son muy formales, no es algo como que ellos publican cosas ni nada. Algunas se vuelven bastante formales, y lo que se ha tratado de hacer en los últimos años es ser muy eficientes y que sean grupos de profesores, porque también hemos aprendido mucho de que entre más hace uno esto colaborativo con otros, como que se avanza más y se es más eficiente. Entonces los mismos colegios están proponiendo temas para que los profesores vayan estudiando en grupos.
¿Quién les enseña a hacer estos inquiries a los profesores?
Nadie, es muy empírico. Hay muchos recursos que se les da para que ellos vean, son básicamente es un ciclo de 4 etapas: recolección de datos, análisis, reflexión, volver a no sé qué. Pero es muy, digamos, hay sesiones de preparación, de professional learning, de desarrollo profesional, para que más o menos tengan la idea de lo que es, y ya cada uno lo hace en su tiempo.
Y bueno, y desde su experiencia, ¿usted ve que de pronto esos inquiries le ayudan a ellos a tener experiencia investigativa cuando entran a un posgrado?
Sí, digamos, yo diría que en lo que he visto, buena pregunta. Digamos, no tengo evidencia así como que haya tomado datos, pero estoy pensando en 3 estudiantes doctorales que tengo en este momento que vienen de ser profesores, son profesores de idiomas en colegios, y una vez empezamos a hablar de estos modelos de Collaborative Action Research y dijeron, sí, como el inquiry que hicimos tal y tal y tal cosa. Entonces, más o menos como que el lenguaje por lo menos lo tienen, y la disposición y como la actitud, más que, digamos, el rigor de cómo recogieron los datos y esas cosas, que no es el más riguroso todo el tiempo. Varía mucho, es lo que diría yo.
Sí, el profesor César Tenorio dice, la evaluación de desempeño anual en el sector público es solo para los docentes regidos para el decreto de la ley 1278 de 2002. Y la evaluación queda por debajo, si la evaluación queda por debajo del 60% durante los 2 años seguidos, el docente es destituido. Claro que aquí es una evaluación de conocimientos, ¿no? De pedagogías, bueno.
Estaban haciendo videos para ser evaluados en la práctica. Yo tengo una pregunta, porque es que mencionaste un tema que resuena mucho con la experiencia que tenemos nosotros cuando trabajamos con colegios, y es esa limitación en tiempo que tienen los profesores, ¿no? A veces hay digamos, mucha motivación, quieren participar mucho en los proyectos, pero se ven muy limitados en su tiempo. Mencionaste la estrategia del pago para que se les descargara el tiempo, y pues nosotros tal vez funcionó con un proyecto grande que tuvimos de Tita, pero fue muy cortito, pero en términos generales nunca contamos con esa estrategia. Y yo me preguntaba, también me decías, no es sostenible en el tiempo, no, es muy costoso. Yo me preguntaba si han encontrado otras estrategias para poder salvar esta dificultad, ¿no? Nosotros hemos intentado algunas cosas, como que vamos a los colegios y los profesores, mientras están con nosotros, trabajan entonces los chicos en algún trabajo, pero están los profesores con un ojo con nosotros y el otro allá. En contrajornada, bueno, hay mucha voluntad, pero algunos no pueden por sus familias, por sus otros trabajos. Entonces, el factor tiempo siempre es un factor muy importante, y siempre sale como una dificultad cuando hacemos las evaluaciones de estos trabajos colaborativos. No sé qué otras estrategias hayan pensado y les haya funcionado.
Sí, desafortunadamente la respuesta no es fácil, y precisamente esto que trató el Ministerio de Educación de Nueva Zelanda de promover el inquiry como una constante en el trabajo del profesor, era eso, hacer que haya una tradición y como que no sea nuevo para ellos reflexionar. Y lo que ha sido más difícil ahí es sistematizar esas reflexiones, porque son como muy contextuales y responden a lo que cada profesor quiere. Lo único que yo he visto que funciona, pero eso es costoso y yo sé que en Colombia eso probablemente no es tan fácil, y lo conozco en colegios privados, por ejemplo, es que hay hora de capacitación metida dentro del horario escolar para todos los profesores, por lo menos 1 hora a la semana para liberarles de, o sea, dentro de su carga horaria está el periodo de professional learning, es lo que quiero decir. Entonces, es parte de y eso sí ahorra mucho porque el profesor no tiene que quedarse más tiempo, ni ya llegar más temprano, ni nada, sino está dentro de su carga escolar. Pero en el sector público no sé qué tan fácil sea.
Los reemplazos, ¿no? Que son costosos.
Sí, se montan los horarios de manera que los estudiantes no se queden solos tampoco, sino, sí, eso requiere una cantidad logística y requiere plata, como todo, pero lo que sucede es que hay que seguir trabajando con los gobiernos para que se den cuenta que la educación es costosa y la educación de calidad es más costosa, pero al otro lado se paga peor si la educación no fue buena. Entonces se vuelve un círculo vicioso. Entonces, si pueden invertir, pues inviertan en lo que tienen enfrente suyo, que es darles el tiempo a los profesores y apoyo a que hagan eso. Entonces, maneras hay. Lo que pasa es que hay que invertirle.
¿Algún otro comentario? ¿De Mar? ¿Micrófono? Sí. Lo oigan, sí.
Muchas gracias, Constanza, por compartir este proyecto que me parece muy buen ejemplo de, digamos, la realidad en la que es hacer investigación con los profesores de colegio. Me llamó la atención como la falta de convencimiento de los profesores de que era un proyecto para la institución y no como un compromiso con un ente externo que llegó y que ejerce una relación asimétrica y por lo tanto hay que cumplir. Al final del proyecto se notó que hubo un cambio de esa actitud y que has podido mirar si has seguido el impacto del proyecto, ha seguido a largo plazo como una convicción de que se puede hacer algo más allá de que fue un compromiso de un periodo en particular.
Sí, tienes toda la razón. Y desafortunadamente, porque además esa es la realidad de la vida, de los 5 profesores, 2 sí tenemos evidencia de lo que hacen hoy en día. De hecho, una de ellas trabaja con nosotros en capacitación y en mostrar lo que ella hizo en este proyecto. De los otros, una se retiró y dejó de ser maestra. Otra cambió de trabajo y no enseñan lenguas. Sí, realmente es mezclado. De los 5, una se fue del país, otra se retiró, otra cambió de esto, entonces solo quedaron 2 en los que tenemos evidencia. Y ese es el riesgo cuando trabaja uno con tan poquitos, que hay la vida natural de cualquier persona es que suceden cosas y cambian. Pero por lo menos con los 2 que hemos podido seguir a través del tiempo, sentimos como alivio, decimos, sí. Y de los 2, sobre todo el colegio de una de ellas, de Kelly, el colegio le ha invertido muchísimo a la interculturalidad a partir de lo que hicimos ahí. Entonces, resultados como mezclados, como casi que un 40%, algo es algo. Ha podido ser 0. Sí, gracias.
¿Alguien más? Bueno, yo tengo como 2 comentarios, reflexiones. Bueno, decía uno de los findings que los profesores expresaban pues su preocupación de que al enseñar la cultura, pues entonces era difícil enseñar el language, ¿sí? Bueno, pues uno entiende un poco esa preocupación porque al enseñar ciertas temáticas culturales requiere un nivel de proficiencia alto también y de nivel de, pues, de habilidades críticas. Entonces, claro, incorporar temas así complicados, por ejemplo, el One Child Policy requiere que los estudiantes manejen pues un nivel más alto de inglés, mientras que enseñarles las rutinas pues es más fácil, ¿sí? Entonces, bueno, esa pues, creo que será mi interpretación al respecto. No sé usted también qué piensa de eso.
Sí, sí. Claramente, por eso lo llamábamos uno de nuestros mayores critical incidents, porque para nosotros fue como saber que ellos entendían que, bueno, entonces ahora que podemos hacerlo intercultural, como los estudiantes no tienen suficiente nivel del idioma que le estamos enseñando para hacer eso en el idioma, entonces pasamos a inglés. Entonces se volvía un poquito, o sea, Por un lado había ganancia, porque entonces el tema y el nivel de proficiencia, ¿cómo se dice proficiencia, dicen ustedes? Suficiencia, perdón, proficiency. Si el nivel de capacidad en la lengua no era un obstáculo para poder afrontar temas que pueden ser de discusión muy rica, pero pues que ellos no tenían el nivel de idioma. Pero por otro lado, fue que ellos totalmente separaron lo de language y culture, que fue lo que más nos preocupó a nosotros, que ellos dijeron, bueno, entonces no podemos hacer culture y entonces hacemos menos language, y les dijimos, no, eso no era. Entonces sí, era así.
En ese caso que estaba mencionando ahorita, ¿no se pensó en proyectos transversales de pronto en donde se incluyeran, por ejemplo, las ciencias naturales y los idiomas, o las ciencias sociales y los idiomas para, digamos, explotar la parte cultural dentro de la investigación?
Sí, en ese proyecto no lo hicimos para nada, entre otras porque de los 5 profesores, 3 no eran generalistas, eran especialistas, entonces ellos iban solo a eso. Pero esa es una de las cosas en las que estamos trabajando ahorita, pero lo que tiene ese riesgo es que entonces vamos a perder los de language, porque entonces dicen, pues si lo intercultural lo podemos hacer en cívica o en sociales o en eso, entonces en languages no se necesita. Y nosotros queremos como tener bastante que ver con eso, pero lo transversal sí es lo que nos interesa, que el profesor de lengua trabaje con fulano o trabaje con el de arte o trabaje con el de música y que se enriquezcan los de las dos áreas, sí, claro, ese es como un ideal. Un poquito utópico porque también es logísticamente muy complicado poner todas esas cosas de horarios y eso juntos, pero sí, esa es una visión muy interesante de verlo transversalmente, por supuesto.
Sí, bueno, que también me llamó la atención pues el ejemplo del One Child Policy en China, que pues hubo quejas de que, ¿por qué hablar de ese tema que es político, pero pues también cultural con los estudiantes? Entonces, ¿cómo los estudiantes se pueden volver críticos si no, pues de sus culturas y de otras culturas, si no se pueden hablar de algunos temas que son importantes? Entonces, ¿quién decide esos temas? Los padres también deberían tener alguna agencia en esa selección de temas.
Sí, es que la conclusión a la que hemos llegado es que lo cultural es político, no lo contrario. Sí, todo lo cultural es político y si uno lo piensa, pues es cierto. O sea, uno puede verlo desde ese punto de vista. Abrir el espacio a los padres es súper complicado. Inclusive en Nueva Zelanda, donde hay una hiperdemocracia, pero digamos que un poquito lo que queríamos como pilotear en este proyecto muy en particular es ver hasta qué punto podíamos hacer unas reflexiones serias con los estudiantes de esas edades y tal vez eso nunca lo escribimos, pero eso es una cosa muy interesante que se logró, que los niños de 11 años sí tienen unas opiniones ya muy formadas y muy claras sobre cuántos hijos puede tener uno y por qué a mí me tienen que decir cuántos hijos puedo tener o no puedo tener, etcétera, etcétera. Eso fue pues interesante de observar. Pero sí, claro, se corren ciertos riesgos y ahí es cuando se depende del contexto de cada colegio y que cada profesor sea muy claro en cómo afronta ciertas cosas en su propio contexto, porque nosotros definitivamente no podíamos hacer eso por ellos. Y fueron, de nuevo, ellos fueron los que escogieron los temas, nosotros nunca les dijimos qué temas escoger, cada uno de ellos iba escogiendo. Pero sí, se corre ese riesgo de que entre más personas se metan en la cosa, más complejo se vuelve. Pero sí, gracias.
Ya hay un comentario último aquí para cerrar, ¿cierto, Norbella? Bueno, en Colombia hay una opción que puede ser aprovechada o si quiere adaptar el currículo sugerido de inglés. Bueno, pero sí, el currículo sugerido tenemos acá, pero es principalmente para los colegios públicos, oficiales. ¿Ah?
Sí, básicamente es un documento que sugiere, guía en el currículo en el nivel de secundaria, bachillerato y para primaria hay uno parecido con otro nombre, pero más o menos es una guía curricular, ¿no? Para implementar el Programa Nacional de Bilingüismo. Bueno, yo le agradezco muchísimo primero a la profesora María Eugenia Guapacha por toda la gestión que ha hecho, por supuesto a la doctora Tolosa, muchísimas gracias por su charla, muy interesante, muy enriquecedora, conocer nosotros del contexto neozelandés. Y por supuesto a todos ustedes, estudiantes y colegas, muchísimas gracias por venir y los esperamos en la siguiente charla de Café y Palabras. Ya les estaremos informando. Que estén muy bien.
Sí, muchas gracias a la audiencia. Hasta luego.